Lady Chatterley's lover. Continuation. My name is Morel Benard. I think the last thing I said was she felt more at home with Lady Chatterley, and after all, it's the mistress of the house matters most, and that's talking about the nurse, Mrs. Bolton. Mrs. Bolton helped Clifford to bed at night and slept across the passage from his room, and came if he rang for her in the night. She also helped him in the morning, and soon valeted him completely, even shaving him in her soft, tentative woman's way. She was very good and competent, and she soon knew how to have him in her power. He wasn't so very different from the colliers after all. When you lather his chin and softly rub the bristles, the standoffishness and the lack of frankness didn't bother her. She was having a new experience. Clifford, however, inside himself, never quite forgave Connie for giving up her personal care of him to a strange, hired woman. It killed, he said to himself, the real flower of the intimacy between him and her. But Connie didn't mind that. The fine flower of their intimacy was to her rather like an orchard, a bulb stuck parasitic on a tree of life, and produced into her eyes a rather shabby flower. Now she had more time to herself. She could softly play the piano up in her room and sing. Touch not the nettle, for the bonds of love are ill to loose. She had not realized till lately how ill to loose they were, these bonds of love. But, thank heaven, she had loosened them. She was so glad to be alone, not always to have to talk to him. When he was alone, he tapped, tapped, tapped on a typewriter to infinity. But when he was not working and she was there, he talked, always talked. Infinite small analysis of people and motives and results, characters and personalities. Till now, she had had enough. For years, she had loved it until she had enough. And then suddenly, it was too much. She was thankful to be alone. It was as if thousands and thousands of little roots and threads of consciousness in him and her had grown together into a tangled mass till they could crowd no more, and the plant was dying. Now quietly, subtly, she was unravelling the tangle of his consciousness in hers, breaking the threads gently, one by one, with patience and impatience to get clear. But the bonds of such love are more ill to loose, even than most bonds. Though Mrs. Bolton coming had been a great help, but he still wanted the old intimate evenings of talk with Connie, talk of reading aloud. But now she could arrange that Mrs. Bolton should come at 10 to disturb them. At 10 o'clock, Connie could go upstairs and be alone. Clifford was in good hands with Mrs. Bolton. Mrs. Bolton ate with Mrs. Betts in the housekeeper's room, since they were all agreeable. And it was curious how much closer the servants' quarters seemed to have come, right up to the doors of Clifford's study, when before they were so remote. For Mrs. Betts would sometimes sit in Mrs. Bolton's room, and Connie heard their lowered voices and felt somehow the strong, other vibration of the working people almost invading the sitting room when she and Clifford were alone. So changed was Wragby merely by Mrs. Bolton's coming. And Connie felt herself released in another world. She felt she breathed differently. But still, she was afraid of how many of her roots, perhaps mortal ones, were tangled with Clifford's. Yet still, she breathed freer. A new phase was going to begin in her life. Mrs. Bolton also kept a Sheraton eye on Connie, feeling she must extend to her female and professional protection. She was always urging her ladyship to walk out, to drive to Youthwaite, to be in the air. For Connie had got into the habit of sitting still by the fire, pretending to read, or to sew feebly, and hardly going out at all. It was a blowy day soon after Hilda had gone that Mrs. Bolton said, "Now, why don't you go for a walk through the wood and look at the daffs behind the keeper's cottage? They're the prettiest sight you'd seen in a day's march. And you could put some in your room. Wild daffs are always so cheerful looking, aren't they?" Connie took it in good part. Even daffs for daffodils, wild daffodils after all. One could not stew in one's own juice. The spring came back. Seasons return. But not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of eve or morn. And the keeper, his thin white body, like a lonely pistil of an invisible flower. She had forgotten him in her unspeakable depression. But now, something roused. Pale beyond porch and portal. The thing to do was to pass the porches and the portals. She was stronger. She could walk better. And in the wood, the wind would not be so tiring as it was across the bark, flattened against her. She wanted to forget the world and all the dreadful carrion-bodied people. Ye must be born again. I believe in the resurrection of the body. Except a grain of wheat fall into the earth and die, it shall by no means bring forth. When the crocus cometh forth, I too will emerge and see the sun. In the wind of March, endless phrases swept through her consciousness. Little gusts of sunshine blew strangely bright and lit up the celandines at the wood's edge under the hazel rods. They spangled out bright and yellow. And the wood was stiller, but yet gusty with crossing sun. The first windflowers were out, and all the wood seemed pale with a pallor of endless little animals sprinkling the shaken floor. The world has grown pale with thy breath. But it was the breath of Persephone this time. She was out of hell on a cold morning. Cold breaths of wind came, and overhead there was an anger of entangled wind caught among the twigs. It too was caught and trying to tear itself free. The wind, like Absalom, how cold the anemones looked, bobbing their naked white shoulders over crinoline skirts of green, but they stood it. A few first bleached little primroses too by the path, and yellow buds unfolding themselves. The roaring and swaying was overheard. Only cold currents came down below. Connie was strangely excited in the wood, and the colour flew in her cheeks and burned blue in her eyes. She walked ploddingly, picking a few primroses and the first violets that smelled sweet and cold, and she drifted on without knowing where she was, till she came to the clearing at the end of the wood and saw the green stained stone cottage, looking almost rosy, like the flesh underneath a mushroom, its stone warmed in a burst of sun. And there was a sparkle of yellow jasmine by the door. A closed door, but no sound, no smoke from the chimney, no dog barking. She went quietly round to the back, Where the bank rose up, she had an excuse to see the daffodils. And they were there, the short-stemmed flowers, rustling and fluttering and shivering, so bright and alive, but with nowhere to hide their faces as they turned them away from the wind. They shook their bright, sunny little rags in bouts of distress. But perhaps they liked it really. Perhaps they really liked the tossing. Constance sat down with her back to a young pine tree that waved against her with curious life, elastic and powerful, rising up. The erect, alive thing with its top in the sun. And she watched the daffodils turn golden in a burst of sun that was warm in her hands and lap. Even she caught the faint, tarry scent of the flowers. And then, being so still and alone, she seemed to bet into the current of her own proper destiny. She had been fastened by a rope, and jagging and snaring like a boat at its moorings. Now she was loose and adrift. The sun gave way to chill. The daffodils were in shadow, dipping slightly. So they would dip through the day and the long cold night, so strong in their frailty. She rose, a little stiff, took a few daffodils and went down. She hated breaking the flowers, but she wanted just one or two to go with her. She would have to go back to Wragby and its walls, and now she hated it, especially its thick walls. Walls, always walls, yet one needed them in this wind. When she got home, Clifford asked her, "Where did you go?" "Right across the wood. Look, aren't the little daffodils adorable? To think they should come out of the earth, just as much out of air and sunshine," he said. "But modelled in the earth," she retorted, with a prompt contradiction that surprised her a little. The next afternoon, she went to the wood again. She followed the broad riding that swerved round and up through the larches to a spring called John's Well. It was cold on this hillside, and not a flower in the darkness of larches. But the icy little spring softly pressed upwards from its tiny well bed of pure reddish-white pebbles. How icy and clear it was, brilliant. The new keeper had no doubt put in fresh pebbles. She heard the faint tinkle of water as the tiny overflow trickled over and downhill. Even above the hissing boom of the larchwood that spread its bristling, leafless, wolfish darkness on the downslope, she heard the tinkle as of tiny water bells. This place was a sinister, cold, damp. Yet the well must have been a drinking place for hundreds of years. Now, no more. Its tiny, cleared space was lush and cold and dismal. She rose and went slowly towards home. As she went, she heard a faint tapping away on the right and stood still to listen. Was it hammering? Or a woodpecker? It was surely hammering. She walked on, listening. And then she noticed a narrow track between young fir trees, a track that seemed to lead nowhere. But she felt it had been used. She turned down it adventurously, between the thick young firs which gave way soon to the old oak wood. She followed the track, and the hammering grew nearer, in the silence of the windy wood, for trees make a silence even in their noise of wind. She saw a secret little clearing, and a secret little hut made of rustic poles. And she had never been here before. She realized it was a quiet place where the growing pheasants were reared, The keeper in his shirt sleeves was kneeling, hammering. The dog trotted forward with a short, sharp bark, and the keeper lifted his face suddenly and saw her. He had a startled look in his eyes. He straightened himself and saluted, watching her in silence as she came forward with weakening limbs. He resented the intrusion. He cherished the solitude as his only and last freedom in life. "I wonder what the hammering was," she said, feeling weak and breathless and a little afraid of him as he looked so straight at her. "I'm getting the coops ready for the young bods," he said, in broad vernacular. She did not know what to say, and she felt weak. "I should like to sit down a bit," she said. Listen to the next episode of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Listen to the next episode of Lady Chatterley's Lover. This is Morel saying I'll see you soon. Okay, bye for now.